Hello everyone, my name is John, I'm the Geek Fanboy, and welcome to this very special series of videos in which I plan to rank and review all 110 episodes of the NBC sitcom Community created by Dan Harmon. I first watched this show back in late 2015 at a time that could not have been more appropriate because I just started my first semester at university. I had to learn to live and be by myself for the first time in my life, and as someone who deals with social anxiety, making friends or getting to know people in general wasn't exactly easy for me when I began my journey as a student. But luckily, I came across that funny little sitcom which was perfectly suited for that new chapter of my life. The funny thing is actually, I only came across the show because I'm a fan of John Oliver and his show Last Week Tonight, and back in 2015 I decided to look up some of his acting work and came across Community. So initially I only wanted to see that funny weird British man being a funny weird psychology professor on a TV show I had never even heard of. But then I watched the pilot and immediately fell in love with that study group full of weirdos, and I haven't looked back since. Today, Community is not only one of my favorite shows ever, it is also one of the best TV shows I've ever seen, period. It certainly is the best sitcom I've ever seen. I rewatch this show at least 2 or 3 times every year, and it is in part thanks to Community that I made it through my years at university, because as weird and kind of sad as it sounds, the Community study group felt like a bunch of fellow students I could hang out with whenever I need some company or cheering up. So now, after having finished another rewatch of all 6 seasons following the truly wonderful announcement of a certain movie finally being in the works, I'm here to rank all 110 episodes of Community. There will be multiple parts to this ranking/review video, one video for each season where I rank the episodes of each individual season, before we get to the final 7th video in which I will rank all 110 episodes in relation to one another. I know I'm not the first person to do this, but I'm a huge fan of all those other Community episode ranking videos out there. It's the kind of content I can watch at any time, so why not contribute to that as well? So today we'll be taking a look at Season 1, which came out way back in 2009, consisting of 25 episodes. I'll be going through the episodes from worst to best, giving my very subjective thoughts on each episode as we go along, and at the end there's going to be a little summary of my thoughts on the overall season. Now, I think this goes without saying, but on the internet you never know, this ranking only reflects my personal opinion. Just because I dislike one episode you happen to enjoy doesn't mean that episode is bad. Besides, I honestly think there are no bad episodes of Community, and yes, that includes all of Season 4. I genuinely enjoy every single episode of this TV show, and the ones that happen to be lower ranked are still good by most TV show standards, and are simply outdone by the absolute brilliance of many of those other great episodes Community has. So please keep that in mind. Keep in mind that I'm biased and rank these episodes very much with my personal enjoyment in mind, but please feel free to put your own ranking down in the comments below. And without further ado, let's jump into Community Season 1. At the bottom of the list, number 25, Romantic Expressionism. In this episode, Jeff and Britta try to dissuade Annie from dating Vaughn, Britta's ex-boyfriend with the tiny nipples, by manipulating Troy into taking an interest in Annie romantically. Meanwhile, Pierce is upset because Arbit, Troy, Shirley and Chang didn't invite him to their bad movie nights and fails to amuse them with his lame jokes. Now, while I do enjoy watching different group dynamics being explored in the show, and can understand why Community addresses the idea of romantic relationships within the group quite frequently, this episode simply suffers from the fact that I think the B-plot with Pierce isn't all that funny, apart from the end where Chevy Chase does his trademark falling over gag, and B, I think Jeff and Britta are being quite horrible in this episode for wanting to ruin Annie's relationship with Vaughn. Not only is it mean enough that they attempt to ruin a source of happiness for their mutual friend for quite selfish reasons, they also manipulate one of their other friends, Troy, while doing so, and inadvertently harm his friendship with Annie as well. I also keep forgetting how many times Vaughn actually pops up in Season 1. I just keep forgetting that after this breakup with Britta, he takes an interest in Annie, and the two actually hit it off quite well. Vaughn just isn't really that interesting of a character. I actually think he's kind of a wanker, and the only reason you sort of might care for him a little bit is because he makes Annie happy, and we like a happy Annie. Granted, at the end of the episode, everyone apologizes and acknowledges that Annie truly likes Vaughn and that the two should be allowed to date. And the scene where all members of the group look at each other as potential sexual partners is admittedly very funny. This episode is just a classic case of basically forgettable and showing some of the main characters in a bad light, so it goes to the bottom of the list. Number 24, Basic Genealogy. It's family day at Greendale, so we meet a bunch of the group's family members. Piers attempts to reconnect with his stepdaughter Amber, who starts to be more interested in Jeff. Britta meets up with Troy and his abusive Nana, and meanwhile Shirley's sons cause trouble for Arvid's father, who has brought along Arvid's cousin Abra. Now, similar to the previous episode, this is very much skippable and includes some storylines like the Arvid-Shirley bit that, while funny in some places, just don't really stick with you. The same almost goes for the Britta-Troy storyline as well, which is basically only saved by the very ending when Britta gets her butt whooped by Troy's Nana, and it's one of the most hilarious yet irritating scenes of the show. The main focus here lies with Jeff and Piers, since Piers clearly wants to be part of a family, which is why he attempts to reconnect with his stepdaughter, but she turns out to be a bit of a no-good-to-be who only has eyes for Piers' money and Jeff's, well, you know. Jeff, who was unceremoniously broken up with in the beginning of the episode, is basically just there at the behest of Annie, but actually just wants to enjoy his newly won sexual freedom. Of course, Jeff comes around by the end of the episode, trying to stop Amber from grifting Piers, but none of this stuff is exactly new or surprising, and only really serves to further highlight Jeff's character development. And while I do think it's quite sweet of Shirley's kids to help Arvid's cousin have fun, that storyline doesn't really make me laugh either. I just think that this episode is overall pretty much forgettable, but does have one or two genuinely hilarious moments which elevate it slightly above romantic expressionism. Number 23, Home Economics. Britta attempts to help Jeff, who is homeless and has moved in with Arvid. Meanwhile, Troy asks Annie for dating advice, but to her disappointment, he intends to ask out a girl named Randy. And meanwhile, Piers joins Vaughn's band and helps write the hit song Getting Rid of Britta. I've honestly never been the biggest fan of the Annie has a crush on Troy storyline, and I'm glad the first season gets over that relatively quickly before the season ends. I simply never saw a possibility of Troy and Annie being a couple, and Annie's crush on Troy is pretty generic and cliched anyway, so I'm not really that invested in her attempt to woo him via helping him woo another girl. Maybe it's the strong sense of second-hand embarrassment I get quite easily, but watching Annie so desperately try to balance her feelings for Troy in this episode does feel sort of cringy in some places. Now, while I don't like that Piers initially ends up mocking Britta because he gets to play some music, I do think it's quite nice to see that he does stand up for her later and chooses to leave Vaughn's group. The storyline surrounding Jeff isn't really that funny or engaging either, but I'm a huge fan of the Jeff-Arvid friendship, and I think this episode is the first one that shows that their friendship is one of the most important and interesting relationships in the entire show. Jeff is just as big a geek as Arvid is, but is less open and embracing of it. But in this episode, we get to see how well the two actually get along. The whole business with Jeff's condo isn't that interesting really, but I will say this line from Jeff as he's offered help by the others is quite funny.
Real deal. The next person that offers me charity or pity will be mentioned by name in my suicide note.
Oh. Overall, a decent episode that explores some new group dynamics, but is lacking in the engagement department. Number 22. Football, Feminism, and You. The Dean, while he attempts to design a new school mascot together with Piers, also blackmails Jeff into convincing Troy to join the Greendale American football team to the dismay of Annie. Meanwhile, Shirley attempts to teach Britta proper ladies' room etiquette. In this episode, we learn more about Troy's past as a football quarterback back during his high school days and how he came to lose his scholarship. The thing is, I actually think Troy's past is quite fascinating, considering that he actually faked the accident and cost him his scholarship because he felt put under pressure. At Greendale, he's finally able to simply enjoy the sport for what it is. That's cool, but we also never really talk about this side of Troy again. I know that his early characterization was meant to focus on the jock stereotype, and I understand why and how they moved away from that, but I think it would have still been interesting if they had at least kept part of that sports-interested persona of Troy's character. It would have been nice to see a character that shows that you can be both a sports person and a geek, two stereotypes Troy would combine brilliantly. Jeff is in this episode basically to just manipulate Troy for selfish reasons, and at the end it doesn't even really work, and Jeff is quite literally left there standing. I do think the storyline with Britta and Shirley is quite funny in a cute sort of way, because we get to see how Britta struggles to both conform and fight gender stereotypes, and that she has to learn that she can indulge in typically feminine rituals without having to sacrifice her whole personality. It also sort of neatly ties in with the other plotline as well, when Annie, upset over Jeff's manipulations, is comforted by Britta, who learns to be more open and vulnerable in the ladies' room. Speaking of Annie, this episode is the origin of her recurring gasp when she sees the Greendale human being for the first time.
Sorry. Hey, say hello to our ethnically neutral mascot.
Decent episode with some fun and interesting character developments that I wish had been explored in more detail, but nevertheless, fun episode, and it includes one of my favorite dialogues from the show when Jeff tries to reason with Troy.
Football player, it's in your blood.
That's racist.
Your soul.
That's racist.
Your eyes.
That's gay.
That's homophobic.
That's black.
That's racist.
Damn.
Number 21. Investigative Journalism. Jack Black decides to join the study group to the discomfort of everyone involved. Meanwhile, Jeff is appointed as the new editor of the school newspaper, while Annie works on a story about the dean. Oh hey, it's the episode with Jack Black and Owen Wilson! Seriously though, I was beyond confused when I saw this episode for the first time. I do think it's a funny idea though, to have a character who has apparently been around the whole time, but he seemed too insignificant we just didn't notice him. In a way, Jack Black's character, Buddy, stands in for the audience, who has been silently watching the group's shenanigans and wish they could be part of them too. Now, obviously, I hope we all aren't as weirdly insistent about it as Buddy, but I do think it makes sense to show an outsider's perspective. And then to have that perspective once again warped right at the end, when we find out that while the study group might be the cool ones to us, to Buddy, the cool study group is actually a completely different group of people. I do love it when the show dissects its own perceptions and the group's perspectives. I also enjoy the MASH parody with Jeff and Abed, despite never having seen MASH, to be honest. Again, the two just have great chemistry, and a school newspaper is always a great college-typical story device to have some fun with. While I do enjoy Jeff's attitude as Hawkeye and Abed's constantly more elaborate indulgence in the homage, the storyline with Jeff trying to keep Annie from running a story on the dean never really picks up and is sort of outshined by the whole Jack Black thing and is then just swiftly dealt with. It's a fun episode with an overall enjoyable plot that has admittedly somewhat intended awkward moments, but it's nevertheless good fun. Number 20. Environmental Science. Upset over his separation from his wife, Senya Chang assigns the class 20 pages of homework. Jeff tries to befriend him in an attempt to reduce the course load work. Meanwhile, Pierce helps Shirley with her public speaking class, all the while Troy and Abed work on a biology experiment involving a lab rat. The opening with Chang dragging Annie out of the classroom while she's still in her chair, only for her to turn up at the window a minute later, is a fantastic opening for this episode. Naturally, Jeff is chosen as the one to help the group, and naturally the selfish Jeff only gets himself out of trouble first, before he eventually comes around and helps everyone involved by reuniting Chang with his wife. I do think Jeff and Chang are a fun combo because Joel McHale and Ken Jeong have such great chemistry, and that really shines through here. I like the little storyline with Pierce helping out Shirley because the two of them usually behave more antagonistically towards one another, so it's nice to see that the two can actually get along quite well, and that Pierce deeply respects Shirley as a person, which is why he wants her to succeed. The Troy and Abed storyline with their lab rat Bible isn't anything special, but quite cute, and their version of Somewhere Out There is genuinely great, so much so that I once chose their particular version of that song for a karaoke session back in my early university days. A good, though somewhat average episode with some entertainingly wholesome shenanigans. Number 19. The pilot episode. After having been discovered that he faked having a lawyering degree, Jeff Winger joins Greendale Community College, where he intends to get through the required classes without doing as much work as possible. As he attempts to woo fellow classmate Britta Perry, Jeff accidentally forms a Spanish study group consisting of a bunch of lovable misfits who will go on to give us many laughs and much enjoyment. This is it, the OG episode that started it all. And considering how hard it is to make a good TV pilot that not only hypes you up for the show, but also manages to engagingly introduce you to the show's premise and characters, this episode is definitely one of the best pilots I've ever seen. The premise and setting are immediately made clear to us, along with a humorous but charming tone letting us know that we're in for a classic sitcom with a slightly different touch. I like that we start the show with Jeff talking to Abed. This is the first friendship duo we ever see on screen. It's the friendship that lasts arguably the longest out of all others, and it is the one we finish the show with as well when Jeff says goodbye to Abed at the airport. And just like Jeff's and Abed's characterizations are crystal clear from scene 1, so are the characterizations of most of our other main characters. Sure, some of them are still a little off from where they will end up being, such as Troy, who starts out as the more stereotypical jock, but we can already see his childish but charming sense of humor coming through. Same goes for Britta, who starts out as the more stereotypical female sitcom lead who refuses to give in to the male main character's advances. She doesn't really have a classic annoying but quirky activist persona yet, and she's generally much more serious in this pilot. We even get a classic Winger speech in this episode as well, and we are even introduced to some cool side characters like the Dean and Ian Duncan. Considering that I initially watched the show just to see John Oliver, his character Duncan is quite funny, and I think he has great chemistry with Joel McHale, and I kinda wish more episodes had picked up the Jeff-Duncan friendship. But obviously I understand that the focus lies on the study group. This episode does a solid job at introducing us to our cast of characters, and the cast is truly great indeed. All of the characters are played brilliantly by their respective actors, and from the first episode alone you can tell that you are in for something great. It's always difficult to deliver a convincing and entertaining pilot, but Community definitely managed to deliver a solid first episode. Number 18. Social Psychology. Jeff and Shirley bond over their mutual dislike for Britta's boyfriend, Vaughn. Even though Jeff tries to be polite about it, he ends up sharing a poem that Vaughn had written for Britta, which eventually ends in the couple's breakup. Meanwhile, Annie joins Professor Duncan in a psychology experiment for which she enlists Troy's and Abed's help. It's another Vaughn episode! Damn, this guy did pop up quite frequently in the first season, and somehow I'm always somewhat surprised by that. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of the Vaughn character, and he essentially in this episode just serves as a plot device for Jeff, who has to learn to not be jealous of Britta's other partners as he learns to accept that she's not interested in him. There isn't really much to say here, but I do enjoy Jeff being paired up with Shirley in this episode because these two do have similar characteristics, and since they are the same age, they are sort of on the same wavelength and can laugh about similar things, as we see in this episode in which they bond over making fun of Vaughn and his tiny nipples. Especially since this is the first time that Shirley is highlighted as a character, it is nice to see that she hits it off with the show's main character as well, even though Shirley still somewhat remains one-dimensional in this episode. Although that makes sense given the fact that this is only episode 3, but I do think this episode already shows her slightly mean but well-intended characterization. Both her and Jeff are honestly quite mean in this episode, especially Jeff for sharing a private piece of information that Britta showed to him. But it is admittedly quite fun to see at the end that Britta and Shirley end up being the ones that gossip, presumably, about Jeff. The storyline surrounding the Duncan principle, while short and not very significant, is the funnier plot as the various characters just absolutely lose it. As I've said before, I like Duncan, he's my favourite secondary character, and it's nice to see him in a B-plot that pairs him up with some of our other group members. It's also ironic that his principle does end up being proven, because in the end he's the one who breaks after a long time of waiting. I also really do like the end to that storyline when Annie confronts Abed for waiting as long as he did, and Abed admits he endured it because he didn't want to disappoint Annie as a friend. That is quite sweet, and I think it shows that Abed is very dedicated and loyal in the friendships he has, even if his methods of showing that can be a little unusual. It's an okay episode with a weaker A-plot and a stronger B-plot, but it depicts the show's strength in pairing up various characters of the study group. Number 17. The Art of Discourse. Following a prank gone wrong, Shirley gets Pierce kicked out of the study group. Jeff and Britta develop a feud with a group of high schoolers who mock them for attending community college, and meanwhile Troy and Abed attempt to accomplish some film-cliched college goals. This is where we focus on an essential and reoccurring issue the group faces. Pierce took something too far, and now the group is faced with the decision if they want to keep him or not. Fittingly, this comes about via Pierce's most multifaceted friendship, namely with Shirley. The two have been seen teaming up in previous episodes despite their differences, but this time their issues, or more like Pierce's issues, reach a new negative high. Of course, Shirley's in the right to feel disrespected by Pierce, and also later the group when they seem to disregard her feelings in turn for their own benefit. In a way, Shirley and Pierce are the two members the rest of the group likes to exclude the most, so it does make sense that by the end of the episode Shirley and Pierce make up because they both feel like they do not receive enough respect from the other members of the group. Despite their understandable antagonism towards one another, I do think the Shirley-Pierce friendship is one of the most interesting combos on the show, because the two have more in common than one might think. Now, the storyline surrounding Jeff, Britta and those high schoolers is honestly just kind of cringe, and I know it's supposed to be dumb because it's about dumb high schoolers doing dumb, outdated jokes. Though I have to admit the 12-minute long duh off at the end of the episode is quite hilarious, especially since it all eventually gets resolved by two adults pantsing three underage teenagers. The ending montage, in which we're told old school teenage movie style what happened to all the characters, is a nice little homage as well, and gives a fun end to an overall decent episode. Number 16. Spanish 101. Senor Chang gives the study group a conversational homework which Jeff wants to use in order to get closer to Britta, but he ends up with Pierce instead. Meanwhile, Annie and Shirley plan on organizing a protest, but they go about it differently than Britta expects. Our first proper episode after the pilot, and it's a solid one. I kind of keep forgetting how focused season 1 Jeff was on getting with Britta, but it shouldn't come as a surprise, and I think it's a good idea that he instead is paired with the most unlikely member of the group, namely Pierce. We can see early on with this episode that Pierce feels both a rivalry and a kinship with Jeff, and that he's continuously on the lookout for the opportunity to connect with him. The elaborate story Pierce comes up with for their Spanish homework is hilarious, and you bet I want to see the presentation in full with all the dialogue and noises that were made throughout. Jeff and Pierce are a duo we'll see more of as the show goes on, but I think this episode shows that Pierce desires a friendship with a younger but mature man, whereas Jeff learns to care more about the relationships within the study group that aren't connected to Britta. Speaking of which, I think Britta is kind of in the right when she points out that Annie and Shirley's protest is a little unconventional. Of course, they should be allowed to protest in any way they want, but you have to admit that the piñata really is a touch too much. The storyline with the three women, however, is not really the focus of this episode and doesn't show us yet who Annie and Shirley really are as characters. Same goes for Abed and Troy, who are barely in this episode, but we see at the very end with their famous Spanish rap that their friendship is about to take off. A solid episode that still focuses a little too much on Jeff and Britta, but already shows us that the strength of the series lies in their cast and how their characters are teamed up. Number 15. Interpretive Dance. Jeff's relationship with Professor Slater is revealed to both the group and the rest of the school, despite the couple trying to keep a low profile. While the two work through some relationship issues, Troy and Britta are shown to have been attending a dancing class, with Troy being afraid of his masculinity being put into question if it's ever revealed that he dances. Now, I've never really liked Jeff's relationship with Professor Slater much, because their relationship seemed to be mostly based on they're both hot and sexually attracted to one another, so of course they have to date. And I get that it's something of a step forward for Jeff, as he is finally able to let go of Britta and instead commit to a serious relationship with someone else, but I honestly think their relationship is never given enough detail for me to care about. I do get how the relationship also serves as a plot device for Britta, who is shown here to still be somewhat interested in Jeff, as she freezes when she sees him with his new girlfriend. I do like the character development for Jeff in this episode, because it shows that he's prepared to somewhat move on from this ladies' man persona that's out to get Britta, and instead he faces the relationship conversation with his partner. That still doesn't make me like Professor Slater very much, because I don't really see why we should care for her as a character, but I do think it's funny in a cute sort of way how the gang sees her as the new mum of the group. Same goes for the conversation Jeff and Professor Slater have with the Dean about the relationship, leading to some serious and not so serious partnership questions. The storyline, which focuses on Troy and Britta, is much more interesting and wholesome in my opinion. Troy and Britta are a great choice for telling a story about gender stereotypes and matters of masculinity, because Britta struggles with being more stereotypically feminine, whereas Troy struggles with the more fragile image of his own masculinity. While it wasn't fair of Troy to not out himself when Britta did, it is honestly somewhat understandable because seconds before that, the group outright mocked Britta for committing to an activity that's typically coded to be feminine. The group is being quite mean here, outright laughing at the fact that femininity is humorous when practiced by a not typically female person. The group somewhat redeems themselves at the very end when they watch the recital, also mainly via Abed, who says that he thinks what Britta and Troy do is really cool. I do like that Troy somewhat overcomes his fragile ego when he decides to help Britta with her dance routine, although it isn't necessarily him overcoming toxic masculinity, but him stepping in because a man helping a woman will always be seen as masculine, regardless of the context. Nevertheless, I do like me some dancing, and Troy and Britta's modern dance at the end is quite entertaining to watch. Plus, the little clip of Abed dancing at the end is super adorable. Number 14. Debate 109. Jeff joins Annie on the debate team in a competition against star debater Jeremy Simmons. Meanwhile, Abed's newest film project seems to predict the future, which frightens Shirley. And meanwhile, Pierce offers his help as a hypnotherapist to Britta in her attempts to stop smoking. This is the episode which first proposes Community's longest lasting and arguably best romantic relationship, Jeff and Annie. I'm personally a big fan of the two of them as a couple, so I'm automatically somewhat biased when it comes to this episode. I think the debate club is a good classic college device to use for a story, and it does the well-known routine of Jeff at first not being interested but then starting to honestly work for something as soon as it becomes personal to him. Joel McHale and Alison Brie have amazing chemistry with one another, and this episode highlights that perfectly. Not only do they have a nice natural flow when they exchange cleverly written dialogue, the sexual and romantic energy between them is very much believable from the get-go, and certainly helps to make their potential relationship more acceptable to those who are understandably somewhat put off by the character's age gap. I think the show manages perfectly to introduce a potential romantic relationship between Jeff and Annie, while still making the growing sexual tension funny, since the episode combines the relationship building with the overly dramatic debate discussion. So Annie and Jeff's storyline is definitely the highlight of this episode, with the other two plot lines somewhat failing in comparison. Now, the story about Abed seemingly being able to predict the future with his films is quite funny, and the episode is showing us that Community very much likes to go for the meta humor, something I'm always a big fan of. It's also hilarious to see other actors play the study group in scenarios that we as the audience are already familiar with. That is also going to be a reoccurring joke in the first season. Now, the storyline with Pierce trying to therapize Britta is the only part of this episode that is honestly forgettable and probably didn't even need to be there. It doesn't tie into anything the other characters are doing, and it only really serves as a placeholder so Britta and Pierce can be in the episode. Overall, it's a good episode which introduces us to a rather important relationship while delivering overall solid and funny entertainment. Number 13. The Politics of Human Sexuality. Annie and the Dean are organising an STD fair where Annie is supposed to demonstrate proper condom usage. At the fair, Jeff and Pierce go on a double date, with Pierce bringing an escort and Jeff a rather immature young woman. Meanwhile, Troy and Abed compete in several sports competitions to see who's the better athlete. This is another episode that essentially highlights Jeff's character development, especially in regards to his role as a ladies' man and his perception of Britta. Jeff and Pierce are partnered up again for this episode, this time to demonstrate Jeff's fear of what's to come, that he'll eventually end up like Pierce, alone and without being able to get a proper date that you don't have to pay for. Obviously, this fear is reflected as well in Jeff's reoccurring midlife crisis issue, which we can see here in his attraction to the younger Sabrina, who is, well, way too immature. I like that we see Jeff becoming more accepting of his age and older people like Pierce and his date Doreen. Since Jeff stands out as someone who doesn't exactly have the best perception of women, it is nice to see his growth in this episode, as we see him move on from regarding Britta as a mere potential romantic partner, and instead seeing her as her own person and a friend. The storyline with Annie being asked to demonstrate condom usage and her being rather anxious about it is not only hilarious but also relatable in my case. When Annie says that she's comfortable with her uncomfortableness, that really rang true for me when I watched this episode for the first time, because as an asexual guy who's always been a little uncomfortable surrounding issues of sex, it was nice to see that it's okay to feel uncomfortable as long as it doesn't harm or hinder you. Also, watching Annie being supported by Britta and Shirley as they break into the dean's office is quite funny too, especially when they catch a glimpse of the anatomically correct model.
Is that considered large?
Yes.
Fun fact, when the dean is told of the break-in by the officer, he actually correctly identifies code 597 to be related to animal cruelty offences. Now, the competition going on between Troy and Abed isn't all that relevant to the rest of the episode, but Troy and Abed are always a fun duo, and I do think all their little sports matches are quite funny. And of course, it leads to the iconic ending, when Abed is the one who has to hurry to the dean's office in order to announce that all the condoms that were handed out at the fair are faulty. Oh, and by the way, did everyone throughout the course of the show just kind of forget that Abed is basically the most talented athlete at Greendale? How is that almost never brought up again or utilized? You would think that's memorable if one of our main characters is literally one of the best athletes on basically the entire show. Good episode with some decent character development for Jeff and some hilarious side storylines. Number 12. Beginner Pottery. Jeff, alongside Annie and Abed, signs up for pottery class in order to get an easy grade. But his plan meets some complications when he becomes obsessed with his classmate Rich, who turns out to be very talented at pottery. Meanwhile, Britta, Shirley, Troy and Pierce sign up for a sailing class during which the crew's friendship with Pierce is tested. Turns out, Jeff has some vanity issues. Unbelievable, I know. Seriously though, all the shenanigans taking place in the pottery class are quite funny, from the teacher forbidding any reenactment of the movie Ghost, to Annie making a rather phallic-looking piece of pottery, eventually leading to Jeff actually learning more about pottery than he initially intended. I always think it's incredibly hilarious to see how dedicatedly Jeff can actually work when he's driven by something that he perceives as a threat to his own person, or by something that seems to attack his fragile ego, because in the end Jeff often ends up doing the exact thing he initially intended to avoid. Especially the moment when Jeff starts gold blooming during his extensive research always gets a big laugh out of me.
No, fine, go ahead, mock me.
Oh, Jeff, you're gold blooming.
Gold blooming? I don't know what that means.
I also think Rich as a character is a good foil for Jeff, because in a way, they're somewhat similar, only that Rich is able to better hide his personal issues, which is fantastically contrasted by that look into the camera and the voiceover of his mother at the end, which is of course reminiscent of the ending of Psycho, a movie I always appreciate being referenced. The storyline with Pierce being abandoned at sea by his fellow crewmates is quite funny as well, since of course only Greendale would offer a sailing class that takes place in the middle of a car park. Once again, the friendship between Pierce and Shirley is sort of the focus here, but this time it's all about Shirley needing to decide if friendship means more to her than a passing grade. The way Pierce returns by making his own boat and then almost actually drowning on land is both inventive and hilarious, and the heroic save by the ship's crew is definitely iconic and wonderfully dramatic. A good episode that splits up its time between two equally fun plot lines with some good references thrown into the mix. Number 11. Advanced Criminal Law. Chang discovers that someone cheated on a Spanish test. When he threatens to fail everyone unless the cheater comes forward, Britta admits to being guilty, leading to her potential expulsion, which Jeff tries to prevent. Meanwhile, Annie asks for Pierce's help in composing a new song for Greendale. Meanwhile, Troy messes with Abed's gullibility and Abed tries to pay him back. I like this episode because it is the first one that properly shows us that Jeff cares more about Britta as a friend than just another woman he wants to romance. We get a genuinely hilarious opening with Chang doing one of his classic weird freakouts where he accuses someone of cheating, and I think it's a fitting and good characterization of Britta to be the one who stands up for the class. It's also a good setup for her and Jeff finally connecting on a more friendly basis, because Jeff's previous experience as a lawyer is being well utilized in this episode, as he offers his help to Britta when she is put before a disciplinary tribunal. I'm personally a huge fan of anything that resembles a courtroom drama, so I'm definitely biased when it comes to the setting for this episode. It is not too often that we get all important Greendale faculty members of a season in one room in the early days of Community, so seeing Chang, Duncan and the Dean all come together and exchange some comedy gold dialogue alongside their interactions with Jeff's lawyer persona is really nice to see, especially since the Chang-Duncan rivalry is genuinely hilarious to watch. Also, this is actually the episode in which the Dean meets Jeff for the first time, so this is where it all began between the two. The fact that the tribunal is held at Borchard Hall, which turns out to be Greendale's indoor swimming pool, is a nice comedic touch as well, and Borchard as a name is even picked up again in a later season when we find out that Greendale's founder is called Russell Borchard. Also, the swimming pool is a fun location because it gives us some fun random nonsense humor, such as the first appearance of the one and only legend, Leonard Rodriguez.
Not me.
Oh, come on, Leonard. If you're going to argue with me, put on a bathing suit.
Busted.
Like I said, I'm a big fan of the courtroom drama setting, and seeing Jeff back in his old lawyer role to defend a friend is always nice to see. Perhaps similar to the audience, Britta herself seems unsure as to why Jeff helps her, assuming that he only does it so he can have another chance with her. But no, Jeff actually admits to genuinely liking Britta as a person, and I think it's important that the show moves on from this pretty basic main male character wants to go with pretty female main character idea quite quickly, and shows the audience that while Jeff is a ladies' man, he also learns to genuinely care about people, so much so that he's willing to defend his still relatively new friend in order to keep them from being exposed. There's more to the show and Jeff as a character than we are shown in the pilot episode, and I think this courtroom drama storyline shows that quite well. The B-plot, which covers Troy messing with Arbet and vice versa, is not on par yet with future Troy-Arbet shenanigans, but this is arguably where it all begins. You can tell that Troy's characterization is still somewhat different in this early episode because later seasons Troy would probably fall for or even indulge Arbet's pretend play to be an alien, but I do think his characterization in this still works well enough. At this point in time, Troy and Arbet aren't the besties yet, we know them to be in the future, and this episode somewhat functions as a basis for their friendship going forward, as this is a point where they establish that they won't lie to one another in the future, and instead just come up with fun stuff together. Also, we see here the classic Arbet characterization, which is related to him taking an idea or a joke way further than anyone would, because Arbet's mind is like a rainbow that picks up an idea and paints it in a bunch of different colors that no one else would think of. The C-plot with Piers and Annie isn't all that remarkable, but still cute and funny. We only get a few episodes which focus on the friendship between Piers and Annie, and considering that Piers always liked Annie best, I think it works quite well that he wants to write a good song because he promised her to do so. Of course, it all goes pear-shaped when it becomes clear that Piers can't write an original song for the life of him, but the end result is still a cute, though copyright troubling song. We're getting to our top 10, starting with number 10, The Signs of Illusion. It's April Fool's Day at Greendale. Jeff pranks Piers by exploiting his devotion to his cult-like religion. Meanwhile, Britta, in an attempt to prove that she's not a buzzkill, pulls a prank that massively backfires on her, causing Annie and Shirley, the new on-campus security guards, to investigate the situation. I massively enjoyed this episode because this is one of the first season's many careful but mostly successful steps towards designing entire episodes around a certain movie genre or homage/parody, and with this episode it's the classic buddy cop movies from the 80s. This episode also reminds me a bit of the Law and Order episode we see later in season 3, with the gang being involved in a ridiculous crime which needs solving. In this case, Britta is the one who committed the crime, and I think that works quite well because this is where we really see the origin of what will later become a running joke with Britta being the worst and a buzzkill. It makes sense that she would want to prove the others wrong, but only fails in doing so by pulling such a weird prank that only she could come up with. Though I have to admit, the way she fails by throwing a corpse out of a window is quite hilarious. And to be fair, Jeff's prank of unknowingly dressing up Piers as the Cookie Crisp Wizard is not the greatest prank ever pulled either, and it's arguably much more mean-spirited because Jeff exploits an old man's religious beliefs.
Guys, you realize you're exploiting the naivete of a man who is being brainwashed by a cult.
See? Britta gets it. Though I have to admit, the longer the bit with Pierce goes on, the funnier it becomes, especially when they hand him the wand that's meant to channel Pierce's energy and they act like some actual spells coming out of the cookie wand. Most of the fun in this episode, though, comes from Annie and Shirley teaming up as the security guards as they fight over the classic buddy cop rules. Who's the badass and who's the by-the-book one? Naturally, both women claim to be the badass, which only leads to friction between the two as they go about their investigation on campus. Arbet is accompanying them since his cable went out and he's basically just coming along providing commentary and further indulging in the buddy cop movie homage. Not only does that help with staying on track with the parody, it also leads to some hilarious meta moments when Arbet recognizes that certain aspects of Annie and Shirley's story don't hit the right notes, which leads to the best scene of the episode.
I'm sick and tired of making excuses for you two. You're an embarrassment to the department. You're off the case and off the force. Your badges, your windbreakers now.
Community always manages to perfectly balance that line between paying homage and doing their own version of a certain piece of media. Annie and Shirley's police shenanigans create a fantastic storyline filled with many hilarious moments, such as when Annie pepper sprays herself, or when both her and Shirley have finally decided to be the badass and start to brutally interrogate Jeff.
Who can confirm that?
Your mama?
What?
Well, I mean...
Oh!
What the hell, Annie?
Her name's not Annie, it's Psycho.
And the ending is both funny and heartwarming as well, when everyone but Jeff makes a confession about their recent actions before they all hug it out. It's a solid, classic episode of Community that is willing to tell a weird story that is still wholesome and manages to engage the viewer on an emotional and comedic level. Also, this episode was the first one to give us
Troy and Abed in the morning, and we're back. Look who's here, Jeff Winger.
so that automatically makes it great. Number 9. English as a second language. When thanks to Annie it is revealed that Senor Chang faked being a teacher, he's sacked and replaced by a strict professor who has the class take a much harder Spanish final, which threatens everyone's grades. Meanwhile, Troy discovers that he has a natural talent for fixing plumbing, which leads to a maintenance worker attempting to convince him to become a plumber. It is admittedly hard to be the next episode of the first ever paintball story, Modern Warfare, but I do think English as a second language managed to be a good follow-up, because the episode decides to take a bit of a hard left, and instead of over-the-top shenanigans, goes back to more classic character-driven college plots that focus on our characters' everyday problems. Considering that Chang is probably the secondary character closest to being a main character, it is nice to see that we get an episode that kind of focuses on him right before the series finale. In a parallel to Jeff's character, Chang himself faked having a degree for the profession he's in, and of course he consults the man himself for help. Like I said before, Ken Jeong and Joel McHale always have great comedic chemistry with one another, which I think leads to some genuinely hilarious moments, such as when the two fight on top of Jeff's car. The duo which receives the more important focus in this episode, though, is Annie and Jeff, I think. We can see in this episode that Jeff is still somewhat shallow and selfish in regards to his life at Greendale because he's unwilling to take Spanish 103 in order to stay together with the group. Annie, understandably, is upset because she fears that she will once again lose her friends like it happened previously with her rehab group. I do actually think that's an interesting and often overlooked aspect of Annie's characterization that is mostly just mentioned in early episodes of the show. Annie spent her high school days not having many friends. Similar to Arbet, she was often considered to be an outsider who was mocked and belittled by others. Now at Greendale, following her rehab, she's able to start over, so of course she desperately wants to keep her newly found group of friends together. As someone who struggles with separation and abandonment issues himself, I find that very relatable. Especially during my university days, I would often worry that friends I'd gotten to know in one semester I would no longer meet as soon as classes we shared were over. Even though it was selfish, I think it is very much understandable why Annie acted the way she did, even though Jeff is also in the right when he's mad at her because she hindered everyone else in the group for her own benefit. The relationship between Jeff and Annie is tested in this episode, which is especially interesting since it becomes clear that Annie still seems to harbour some feelings from her kiss with Jeff in Debate 109. When describing her outfit to Jeff, she says,
You don't have to dress like this to grow up. You look like a travel agent.
You don't like it? I was going for more of a professor thing.
What?
This is obviously in reference to Jeff's previous girlfriend, Professor Slater, so Annie seems intent on drawing Jeff towards her in a more romantic way. And even though Jeff berates her in front of the group, causing her to run away crying, Jeff of course still deeply cares for her. When he hears that she intends to confront Chang, Jeff immediately worries about her well-being and comes to her rescue. Even though the moment is quite nice, it is also admittedly quite funny when it's revealed that Annie's screams out of Chang's office come from his keytar. The emotional stakes are combined with the academic ones as the group is in danger of failing their Spanish final. But luckily, in a quite amusing and yet great character moment for Pierce, it turns out that the old man actually spent a night with the professor so she could make the test easier. Meanwhile, Troy is revealed to be quite good at fixing the plumbing, an aspect of his character which will turn out to be quite important later in the series, and which I had totally forgotten is already introduced in Season 1. In a storyline which is meant to be reminiscent of A Beautiful Mind, Troy is told that he should rather focus on his gift instead of his academic career, a sentiment which is even uttered by Arbet, though he arguably only does that in order to pay homage to the movie Good Will Hunting. Admittedly, I think Troy's plotline lacks a bit of an ending in this episode, but considering that this essentially works as a very early setup for an aspect of Troy's character that will become more important in seasons 2 and 3, I think the storyline does a well enough job of giving Troy a serious question to consider. Stay a student at Greendale, or properly enter adult life by becoming a plumber? This whole episode has a bit of a finale vibe, and considering that it's only the second to last episode, that's quite saying something when the show already manages to raise the stakes in a regular episode such as this one. I think this sets up some emotional heavyweights before the show goes into its first season finale. In episode 24, the show deals with the character's academic finale, and in the 25th episode, there will be more of an emotional finale for the characters. A good episode, which had to be a follow-up to arguably one of the best episodes of the entire show, and serves as a great appetizer for the final episode of the first season. Speaking of which, number 8, Pascal's Triangle Revisited. It's the end of the study group's first year at Greendale. While Chang and Duncan are caught up in a feud of their own, the study group has to deal with personal issues of their own. Troy moves out of his dad's house, planning to moving in with Abed, who does not want them living together. Meanwhile, Annie thinks about transferring schools in order to stay together with Vaughn. Meanwhile, for the transfer dance, Britta is nominated to be queen, causing Professor Slater to admit that she still likes Jeff. During the dance, both women profess their love for him. Jeff, unsure how to respond, leaves the dance and runs into Annie. The season comes to a close as the two end up sharing a passionate kiss. It's the season finale and it's a strong one. Seriously though, similar to season openers, finales are arguably even harder to pull off, but Community does it brilliantly by giving the main characters an emotional climax while not forgetting about its classic sitcom shenanigans and the inclusion subversion of some familiar genre tropes. We've seen the academic climax of the first season in episode 24, and with this episode, we finally conclude one of the major storylines which has accompanied Jeff throughout his first year at Greendale. Does he want to be with Britta, the woman who started all this, or does he want to be with Slater, his first long-term girlfriend in quite a while? We've seen hints of this being the final plotline for season 1 in previous episodes, such as the Halloween or Valentine's Day episodes. It's quite entertaining to watch Britta in this episode, seeing how confident and self-assured she presents herself as a woman and a potential romantic partner for Jeff. I do think you can already tell in this episode that she is still somewhat unsure of her feelings for him, because we do get the notion that she pursues Jeff and professes her love for him mostly to defy Slater. Speaking of which, I'm still not the biggest fan of Professor Slater as a character, and the way she's reintroduced in this episode is very abrupt and out of basically nowhere. Basically, she's just brought back so we can create a love triangle for Jeff. I do see Slater more as a foil for Britta and a plot device for Jeff rather than a character we're supposed to be interested in, but she does fulfill her needed role quite well. I do also genuinely enjoy the short heart-to-heart Jeff has with Britta before Slater professes her love as well. Slater is definitely more petty about the whole affair than Britta, and I think this can be seen especially well when Jeff, overwhelmed by the situation, leaves the dance and takes one last look at the two women. Britta actually smiles and nods at him, and I always took this to mean that she understands Jeff's struggle and respects his decision to leave the situation. She wanted him to know how she felt in that moment, but she's also considerate of his wish to distance himself in order to work through his feelings. And the way in which Jeff ends up distancing himself from the situation is pleasantly surprising and emotional. Which brings us to Annie. I never really understood why Annie liked Vaughn. The relationship was even more awkward than Vaughn's short relationship with Britta. Even less so I understand why Annie would want to transfer, considering that previously she was immensely worried about losing her friends and even attempts to manipulate their grades so they could stay together for a longer time. Her decision to leave serves more as a plot device, so her appearance at the end seems more surprising to the viewer. Of course, this also serves to play with overly emotional sitcom cliches the show constantly picks up and subverts, and this of course plays out right until the very end when Jeff is caught up in a love triangle and instead of choosing one of the women who profess their love to him, he opts out for a third option that had not even presented itself until this very moment. Something along the lines of, the right one was there all along, Jeff just didn't see her. Even now, and especially at the time, it feels like a refreshing solution to the love triangle scenario because the show refuses to pair Jeff with any of the two women the storyline thus far has presented him with, and basically refuses to fulfill the sitcom stereotype by choosing. This gives the season a great emotional ending which leaves you surprised, perhaps shocked, and definitely curious as to how the show will pick up this relationship dilemma in season 2. In regards to the B-plot surrounding Troy, Arbet, and Pierce, of course it is overshadowed by the Jeff love triangle, but I do think it's nice to see that we get some development from the Troy-Arbet friendship, as we see that Arbet is worried about putting strain on it, and that the two are facing some true emotional conflict with one another for the first time. Troy, realizing there's something like too much of a good thing via digesting a giant biscuit, is a funny way of depicting his thought process. I do like the solution to the problem when Troy decides to move in with Pierce instead. However, I have to admit that the show here comes up with a great premise for future stories which never really take place, because Troy and Pierce being flatmates never becomes the source or focus of a major plot in season 2. Something similar minimally bothers me about the reason why Arbet doesn't want Troy to move in. He worries there's going to be too much strain on their friendship, but then in season 3 they just move in together anyway without that issue ever being brought up again before or afterwards. Apart from the study group's issues, it's always also really funny to see the Chang-Duncan rivalry play out throughout the episode. Those two have some of the funniest interactions throughout the whole season, and seeing their rivalry come to a climax in this episode is hilarious to watch. Especially Duncan, whose gleeful mocking of Chang always gets a chuckle out of me. Especially when we get to the dance and an absolutely pissed Duncan ends up performing a rap that gets him sacked, causing Chang to finally fight him. It's a fun comic relief plot that runs throughout the episode, and one that will luckily be picked up in season 2. All in all, this is a great season finale which manages to resolve and intensify the emotional issues our main characters have faced, with some genuinely fun bits in between, making this a strong closing episode for season 1. Number 7. Communication Studies. On Valentine's Day, a drunk Britta leaves an embarrassing message for Jeff, who then tries to remedy the situation by getting drunk with Arbet so he can leave her an equally embarrassing message. Meanwhile, Troy and Pierce are bullied by Chang, causing Annie and Shirley trying to pull a prank on their teacher. A classic, good old-fashioned community shenanigans episode in which our characters get into unforeseen trouble and have to resolve the issue in the most hilarious way possible. I always love the episodes of Community which are set around a certain themed party or day at the school. In this case, it's Valentine's Day, and of course, since Jeff's relationship issues have been a central storyline for a good chunk of season 1, we now have a good reason to take a closer look at Jeff's relationship with 2 women in his life. While I'm neither a fan of the Jeff-Britta couple nor the Jeff-Slater relationship, I do think this episode is both hilarious and wholesome in how it tries to resolve the problem which is presented to Jeff. Not only does Britta's message provide some personal amusement for both Jeff and the viewer, it also shows us that Britta might indeed still harbour some feelings for Jeff, something that clashes with Jeff's relationship with his current girlfriend, Professor Slater. This episode essentially serves as a bit of a setup for the season finale, where this exact same emotional conflict will be brought up again for Jeff when he's confronted with the true feelings of both Britta and Slater. What I think makes this episode so much fun is, yet again, the Jeff and Arbet friendship, which is utilised excellently in this episode. Because Arbed rightly points out that Britta's drunk dial caused a shift in her relationship with Jeff. And of course the only way to remedy the situation is by getting Jeff drunk as hell and have him leave Britta an embarrassing message as well. And watching Jeff and Arbed trying to make the message in question happen will always be one of my season 1 highlights. This already starts when Jeff approaches Arbed for help and we watch Arbed direct a group of actors, including a kid playing Chang, and they are reenacting a scene we just saw. When it becomes clear that Jeff can't pretend to be drunk, him and Arbed decide to do it for real, and the montage which follows is entertaining as heck. We get weird costumes, Breakfast Club references, hilarious character moments, a random pizza delivery guy, and fantastic music, and all of that leads to Jeff eventually having called both Britta and Professor Slater. Even seeing Arbed and Jeff fight through a hangover as they rejoin the group gets a good chuckle out of me every time. Of course, it later turns out that Jeff left the message for Britta on Slater's phone and vice versa. I do love that Britta takes advantage of this by pranking Jeff, sort of giving him a taste of his own medicine. Even though at first it seems like her prank causes Jeff's relationship to crumble, I do like that Britta decides to take the high road and proves to Slater that Jeff does actually like and appreciate her as his girlfriend. Even though she still seems to have some feelings for Jeff, Britta wants him to find his happiness, and she's willing to sacrifice part of her own happiness for it. That is some seriously good character work, and I think it's nice to see that for once the show leans a bit more into highlighting Britta at the end there instead of Jeff. This story essentially serves as something of a setup for the finale of season 1, since this exact problem, Jeff finding himself between his feelings for Britta and Professor Slater, will be the emotional climax that will close out the season. We see here why and how Jeff cares for both women, and that Britta, despite doing her best to convey the opposite, does feel for Jeff in a romantic sense and seems somewhat dissatisfied with the current situation. Of course, this wouldn't be a great episode of Community if there weren't some college shenanigans going on, and once again we have Shirley and Annie on it, this time being the ones who commit the pranks instead of fermenting them. I do think it's quite nice to see that both women care about the men in their group, even Pierce, and that they are willing to indulge in some illicit college behavior when it comes to teaching bullies a lesson. In a similar vein, Troy and Pierce are shown to be just as caring and protective when it comes to their female friends. While it is admittedly hilarious to see them dressed in those ridiculous pantsuits simply because they look funny, I do think it's an amusing but wholesome moment when the two men decide to wear the costumes to the Valentine's Day dance with Chang anyway, so Shirley and Annie won't. Besides, it all leads to a rather funny end tag when the two men leave the party and Pierce decides to abandon Troy for Chang. A great episode with a good mix of classic Green Day shenanigans and emotional stakes, leading to a surprisingly emotional but funny story. Number 6. Physical Education. Not going far, we're jumping to Communication Studies follow-up episode. Jeff looks forward to being cool in billiards class, but upon discovering that the instructor insists on wearing the regular, unflattering PE outfit, the two develop a rivalry. Meanwhile, the rest of the group finds a romantic sketch of Arbed in a Spanish textbook, and they are hell-bent on setting up Arbed with the girl who made the drawing. This episode already deserves a top 10 position because of its introductory joke when Britta drops a bag of bagels and we get both a funny Arbed reaction and an even more hilarious line from Britta.
13.
Oh, great. So much for bagels.
So much for what?
The bagels. You dropped them on the floor.
To this day, bagel is a joke I reference whenever I can, and the scene is only made funnier by Arbed's Rain Man-esque line when he sees the bag falling over. Speaking of Arbed, I think this episode does some great work when it comes to delving into his characterization, his relationship with the study group, and how he's perceived by others. Because Arbed is socially awkward and has often been seen having trouble when it comes to approaching or interacting with other students, the study group, except for Jeff, falls into a classic sitcom trope of wanting to teach Arbed how to approach a pretty girl because they believe his general personality will not be attractive enough. Personally, I also found Arbed to be very relatable in this episode, especially once the study group tries to convince him to go and talk to Jenny, and Arbed is straight up just not interested in talking to the girl. Setting someone up for a date is such an unpleasant thing to do and an equally annoying sitcom trope, so I'm all the more entertained by this episode because it follows through on the familiar trope, but of course in an unusual way. Arbed does approach the girl, but the first time it's as a vampire, and when they plan their second attempt, they straight up try to change Arbed all the way by having him imitate someone else. I like that Jeff here is the only one who seems to understand what Abed actually needs, despite him being unable to find that same sentiment for himself until the end of the episode. Shows once again that Jeff, next to Troy, is the one who really gets Abed as a person. And to give the classic sitcom trope a final twist, we get that funny but emotionally deep scene with Abed and the rest of the study group once his attempts at wooing Jenny have failed. Contrasting their initial belief, Abed is not upset about the romance not having worked out. Instead, he explains how he experienced the whole situation.
So we didn't damage your self-esteem or anything?
Bert, I got self-esteem falling out of my butt. That's why I was willing to change for you guys.
I think it's quite telling that Abed is willing to indulge the group's attempts to change him because he doesn't want to upset them. Mentioning a history of bullying, I think it makes a lot of sense that Abed attempts to fulfill his friends' expectations of his wooing of Jenny because he does not want them to feel disappointment because they were unable to quote-unquote fix him. It once again shows how loyal and deeply caring Abed is actually feeling when it comes to the study group, and that he feels safe around them. Like he says, he's secure enough in his own personality that he doesn't mind changing for them. And this exact sentiment is what inspires Jeff. See, Jeffrey here has been fighting with his own issues regarding self-perception and his ability to accept his own personality without his ego taking over. Granted, in this case, it's in a more ridiculous and hilarious way because Jeff has a problem wearing gym shorts. What I love about Jeff's storyline is that it's essentially just a parallel to Abed's plot in this episode, but the show just wants to be more comedic about it, but it still gives Jeff some valid character development while disguising said development as an absolutely overly dramatic billiards duel in which Jeff and an old man tear off their underwear and expose themselves to the entire school. A genuinely hilarious finale with some nonsensical wholeheartedness when Jeff and his teacher embrace at the end. Like most great episodes of Community, this episode is a fantastic mix of everyday Greendale nonsense and hilarious character moments. Number 5. Introduction to Statistics. For Halloween, Annie hosts a Day of the Dead party at which Pierce gets high and has a really bad trip. Meanwhile, Jeff flirts with his statistics teacher, Professor Slater, which upsets Shirley, but seemingly not Britta. It's Community's first ever Halloween episode, and boy, is it a good one. As I said before, I love Community's episodes which are set around a themed day such as Valentine's Day or Christmas, and next to them, this Halloween episode looks quite good. There are so many funny little jokes and side gags in this that I absolutely love, such as Pierce accidentally calling his mum, Britta and Slater introducing themselves to one another, and of course Albert being Batman, marking the first proper time he pretends to be a different persona for an extended amount of time. Then, of course, there's Shirley going absolutely hog wild as she tries to channel her feelings regarding her husband, and naturally there's Pierce, who might have one of the craziest fever dreams we ever see on the entire show, which is only enhanced by his whole Beastmaster persona. This episode does what Community is great at. Wrap up fun but interesting character development and moments in hilarious and entertaining everyday college shenanigans. Of course, Jeff stands out again at the center of this episode, with him finally moving on from Britta by approaching his statistics professor, making this Professor Slater's first official appearance. Again, I'm not her biggest fan, and we're shown here that nothing really connects her and Jeff apart from their sexual attraction. But in this first episode, Jeff's interest in the professor serves more as a plot device which is meant to symbolize Jeff overcoming his ladies' man persona that is still somewhat embarrassed by his new friends, leading to him showing that he honestly does care for them and is prepared to leave a hot date behind and instead deal with some unusual circumstances that will help his friends. The episode even manages to deal with the emotional lives of some of its other characters. Annie is troubled by her fear of losing the joy of her friends and classmates as she attempts to plan a great party. Britta admits that she perhaps is somewhat upset by Jeff wooing another woman. And Shirley's marriage is given more attention as she channels the anger she feels towards her husband having a new girlfriend into hating on Professor Slater. I think it's great that Shirley is put more closely into the center of an episode, even though the main focus still remains with Jeff. By the end of the day, this remains an immensely funny and entertaining episode of Community, with some great jokes and hilarious character moments, making this a fantastic Halloween episode. Number 4. Comparative Religion. Shirley plans a Christmas party for the study group, but is surprised when she learns that everyone else is from a different religious background and struggles to combine her Christian ways with everyone else's beliefs. Meanwhile, Jeff stands up to a bully named Mike that harassed Abed. They set up a fight and the study group supports Jeff in his endeavor while trying to prevent Shirley from hearing what's going on. It's Community's first ever Christmas episode. The Christmas episodes usually tend to be quite the highlight for this show, and the first one shows that exceptionally well. What I love about this episode is that it gives a deeper look into the characters' personal lives, since this episode takes the idea of the Christmas special and turns it on its head by telling us early on that all except one of our main characters does not even properly celebrate Christmas. It's wonderful to see that the study group is such a diverse group of people in multiple ways. It gives us varying perceptions on the same thing and multicultural backgrounds influencing the characters' behavior and thinking. The last time I watched it, I realized that if this show and this very episode were released nowadays, I don't want to know what the outcry about forced PC-ness and diversity would be. But this is what I love about this show. It has such a diverse cast of characters with which the show still manages to tell or address more traditional sitcom themes such as the classic Christmas episode. Perhaps similar to Shirley, the audience struggles a bit by not receiving a more old-fashioned holiday special, but instead one that focuses on universal values, which anyone of any religion understands by telling a comedic story which includes stupid jokes, hilarious dialogue, and dramatic punching. I've mentioned before when I talked about Pierce that apart from him, Shirley is probably the most prejudiced character within the study group, and this episode problematizes that issue excellently. Shirley is one of those characters that receives less focus than some of the others in season 1, so it's nice to see that one of the main aspects of her character is addressed in this Christmas episode. It's clearly shown that Shirley is prejudiced when it comes to other religions, and that she has issues overcoming her own religious pride, but learns to accept her friend's beliefs and even comes around to agreeing with Jeff's decision to fight when she sees that sometimes someone else's way is the better one. Speaking of Jeff, he steps in when Albert is bullied by one of the kids from the Breakfast Club. Anthony Michael Hall plays the overly dramatic bully absolutely brilliantly, and his introduction scene is very funny when he gets upset over a Christmas cookie and is then called out by Jeff. The training session with everyone except Shirley is a great classic dialogue scene with everyone making jokes and references, my favorite being Troy teaching Jeff the Forrest Whitaker eye. When Shirley discovers that Jeff intends to get involved in a fight during Christmas, she becomes very upset and forces everyone to choose between her or Jeff's fight. I think it's interesting that similar to Annie, Shirley has that fear of losing her newfound family, but in her case, Shirley wants the study group to conform to her way of thinking so she can have the Christmas she always had with her old family. But now, with a new group of people, she has to learn that things are different, but that they can still have fun celebrating despite their different beliefs. Jeff has a somewhat similar realization when he finally faces Mike and decides to not fight him because Shirley taught him to be kind. I do love it when Shirley joins the confrontation and sees Jeff being beaten up and encourages him to fight back, because sometimes that's just what you have to do because the bully, unlike Jeff, is unable to take the high road. The fighting montage which ensues is hilarious and transitions into a wonderfully wholesome scene in the study room, with the whole group celebrating together and Shirley sing a non-denominational version of Silent Night. At the end, the episode is wrapped up perfectly by another classic Troy and Albert end tag, during which they and Jeff sing the classic Christmas carol, Oh Christmas Troy. A wonderful first Christmas episode, and overall a great story with some genuinely hilarious but also emotional moments. We're getting into our top 3, starting with number 3, Introduction to Film. Jeff signs up for a seemingly easy class which is all about seizing the day. However, it turns out to be more complicated than he thinks. Meanwhile, Britta financially supports Albert so he can study film, which his father doesn't approve of. There's a reason for why this episode is so highly ranked on this list, and it probably won't come as a surprise. Albert is my favorite character on the show. He's one of my favorite characters from any TV show ever, actually. So of course I'm biased when it comes to episodes that focus on him, and Introduction to Film is the first one to do so in a surprisingly emotional way. In this episode, we learn more about Albert's family background and his wish to become a filmmaker, as we learn that he was raised by his father after his parents' divorce, and now his father wants him to support the family business instead of Albert being allowed to study what he is passionate about. This episode gives us a bit of an explanation why Albert struggles to communicate with the people around him, especially when it comes to his father. Albert was, and presumably still is to some regard, very close to his mum. Presumably she was the parent who understood him a little better, but even the love they shared couldn't keep the family from breaking apart when Albert's parents divorced. What we see in this episode is that Abed often fails to communicate deeper feelings in a clear and normal way, also because he doesn't know how to read people. So instead he took to TV shows and movies and has turned to the art of filmmaking in order to express himself, because it's the only way he knows how to convey his thoughts. Abed's feelings about his mother leaving and his general family background are a central theme for his character, one that is often subtly hinted at, but is also sometimes used as a premise for entire episodes, such as this one, where the theme makes its first appearance, and later also in episodes such as the Season 2 Christmas episode, in which Abed once again escapes into the world of TV and film in order to cope with his family issues. What gets me every time in this episode is the great payoff at the end. Up until this point, we have only seen Abed's actions from the outside. Just like Britta, we are confused and perhaps even frustrated by Abed's behavior. We're perhaps even angered that he abuses Britta's financial support, as we wonder what the hell he's up to and why he's behaving even more strangely than usual. But once we get to the end and see the film Abed has been working on, it all shifts to a new perspective as we come to understand the message he was trying to convey to his father. Their conversation always gets to me, as they both acknowledge, for the first time presumably, that the mother leaving caused a rift in their relationship. It's also hinted at that the parents divorced in part because they had problems dealing with Abed's neurodivergent behavior, an aspect that's quite serious because it addresses the sad reality that oftentimes parents who raise kids with autism or something similar often struggle to do so, which can in some cases lead to severe family issues. That's why I think it's both important and interesting that we get to hear this short exchange between Abed and his dad. It's a genuinely emotional and heartfelt moment in the show that, up to this point, has been mostly about the comedy. Here we see that there's much more to Community than to being the weird meta-joke show, but a story about characters that still experience real-life problems amongst all the college shenanigans. The more comedic aspect of this episode lies more in Jeff's storyline, and also the little side story Troy and Pierce have going on. Troy and Pierce's storyline is pretty minimal, but quite funny I think, especially since this episode includes one of the most hilarious lines from Troy.
Involved in each other's personal lives. Hey, Troy sneezes like a girl. And how about I pound you like a boy? That didn't come out right.
This episode leans more into the initial idea of teaming up Troy and Pierce, and I do think it works quite well here actually, despite its storyline not taking up much screen time. Now, Jeff in this episode is his classic Season 1 self, a student who wants to take the easy way out by taking an absolutely ridiculous Dead Poets Society class as it could only be offered at Greendale. Professor Whitman is quite the ridiculous but entertaining character, and I do enjoy his dismissal of Jeff while saying and doing the most outlandish things. I think it's interesting that Jeff seems to be genuinely unable to live in the moment, as I think this makes a lot of sense this early in his character development. Jeff doesn't truly care about Greendale yet. He's only there out of necessity and only thinks about his future as a lawyer instead of appreciating his time at Greendale with his new friends. We can see that he doesn't fully understand yet the way in which his school and his friends work, because he's trying to find the easy way out, both for his class and in how he deals with Abed and Britta. I do think it's quite funny how him and Britta are pushed into the roles of Abed's parents, and watching Jeff trying to parent is both hilarious and interesting if you take Jeff's own father-related issues into consideration. As is often a theme for Jeff's stories, instead of lazing off, he ends up doing the thing he initially wanted to avoid, and even then, he's unsuccessful because, unlike Abed, Jeff hasn't found yet what defines his life at Greendale, or something he wants to focus on. Jeff is too caught up with thinking about his future as a lawyer, so he's unable to live in the moment and perhaps needs to learn from watching Abed what it means to find something that you are actually passionate about and can express your true self through. I think this is Community's first really strong episode, which makes you go, okay, this is something special. And it perfectly demonstrates how Community continuously manages to mix both humor and sincere emotions quite effectively, making this episode an early high note of the season. And at number 2, we have Modern Warfare. A school-wide game of paintball assassin runs out of control as the price of priority registration is at stake. The study group desperately attempts to stay in the game while simultaneously fighting tensions within the group. The paintball episodes of Community are always a highlight, and this is the one that started it all, and it perfectly demonstrates why the paintball episodes are as good as they are. With a perfectly executed mix of genre homage, humor, and personal tension, Modern Warfare really delivers on what makes an episode of Community great. This is just a genuinely entertaining and fun episode, starting with the group finally getting tired of the tension between Jeff and Britta, which leads to Jeff taking a break in his car, after which he wakes up to the campus looking like it went through an apocalypse. This is where the episode begins properly, as the tension is immediately raised when Garrett, in a hilarious, horrified voice, tells Jeff about the paintball game. And in typical Jeff Winger fashion, he does not want to join the ridiculousness of the school right up until he hears the priority registration is the price, and then he's all in. The action movie vibes this episode implements are not only fitting, but also effective, such as Abed's badass Riddick entrance or Jeff's Die Hard-esque outfit in which he later confronts the Dean in spectacular Rambo fashion. Naturally, the whole premise is in and of itself in the style of Battle Royale, which immediately raises the stakes because not only does our study group have to face their fellow students, but we also see the friends fight amongst one another, leading us as the audience to question who we would like to see win and who will come out on top by the end of the episode. Similar to the action movies which inspired this episode, the overall plot of the episode doesn't need much explanation, and instead you just sit down and have a half hour of fun with witty dialogue, humorous but amazing action, and even some great character moments from some members of the study group. There are some great dramatic and also comedic moments for our study group, such as Shirley's death or when Chang enters the study room threatening Jeff and Britta. If you are unsure about Community being brilliant before, this should be the episode which proves that Community isn't just any other run-of-the-mill sitcom, but a show that knows how to play with the sitcom setting and enhances it with absolutely ridiculous genre fun and movie homages. In terms of story and character development, this episode mainly serves as something of a calm before the storm, because it's mostly unconcerned with the study group's academic life or their personal issues, apart from Jeff and Britta, of course. This episode finally decides to deal with their unresolved sexual tension, which I have to admit, I have never really felt before this episode. Yes, Jeff took an interest in Britta, but the first season never fully explored that apparent sexual tension between the two, especially not from Britta's side. So when I watched this episode for the first time, the two end up shagging, I never felt that was a satisfying payoff. Instead, it felt forced upon the characters, especially on Britta, because before that she had shown to have something of an interest in Jeff, but nothing all too serious that would make her want to have sex with him. Abed actually makes the point for me in this very episode.
Explains it best. To be blunt, Jeff and Britta is no Ross and Rachel. Your sexual tension and lack of chemistry are putting us all on edge, which is why, ironically, and hear this on every level, you're keeping us from being friends.
I see how this serves as something akin to a setup for the finale, but I simply was never the biggest fan of the Jeff-Britta pairing, and I didn't quite understand why the show was trying to make them a thing. Luckily, Jeff and Britta's sexual tension is only a side plot within this fantastic episode, and Jeff's more egotistical attitude throughout the episode even pays off, when at the end, he comes around and gives the price of priority registration to Shirley so she can spend more time with her children. Modern Warfare is an absolute classic when it comes to Community episodes, and for good reason. It's the first episode to introduce us to the paintball setting, and it uses that setting brilliantly by telling a funny and simply entertaining story that knows how to give the classic sitcom that special something, which would eventually make Community a standout television show. And last, but by no means least, we have reached our top spot. Number 1, Contemporary American Poultry. In a mafia film-styled episode, Jeff plans to skim chicken fingers from the school cafeteria, but slowly realizes that Abed is taking over control, leading to dynamics in the group being left shaken. I don't think it comes as a surprise when I tell you that Community's genre homage/parody episodes tend to be my favorite ones of the whole series, and Contemporary American Poultry is where that trend for the show began. Sure, it's not as elaborate yet as some other genre-themed episodes are going to be, but this does so much with so little. As usual, Community manages to take a quite banal and comedic premise, in this case the study group wanting chicken fingers, and the show wraps that premise up in such an interesting setting which elevates the viewing experience to a whole nother level. The mafia movie genre is known to almost everyone, even if you haven't seen any of the bigger gangster movies such as The Godfather or Goodfellas, this episode still works because the average viewer will be familiar with mafia cliches and gangster stereotype. And I'm saying that because I was that kind of viewer when I saw this episode for the first time. At the time, I'd never seen any of those classic mafia films, but that did not prevent me from massively enjoying this episode, because Community always manages to make its homages understandable and enjoyable, even to those who might be unfamiliar with the source material. And if you do happen to be a fan of the genre that's being explored, then it only increases your enjoyment because you'll be able to view the episode through another lens and maybe pick up on some details and Easter eggs. Also, since this episode is told through the perspective of Abed, he makes sure that we don't miss out on any of the staples of the genre by guiding us through the classic mafia film plot beats, and even kind of helps the viewer out by pointing out some of said staples if the viewer happens to be unfamiliar with them. Speaking of Abed, yes, this might be my favorite character bias winning here, because this is indeed an episode which focuses on him as a character and as a narrator. Plus, this episode is about my favorite friendship within the group, Abed and Jeff. So yes, this episode covers many of my favorite aspects of the show, and that's why I love it so much. But back to the plot for a moment. This episode includes so many great moments that aren't even part of the mafia shtick, such as Pierce's iconic coining of the phrase, "streets ahead."
Streets ahead is verbal wildfire.
Does it just mean cool, or is it supposed to be like miles ahead?
If you have to ask, your street's behind.
Same goes for one of my favorite scenes from the episode, the job interview montage, when we get Troy in that ridiculous outfit and Pierce answering the phone as a certain former president. Another short but neat detail is the whiteboard on which Abed has listed the likes and needs of everyone in the study group, and includes such interesting information as Britta liking bums, Abed liking banjo music, and Jeff needing admiration and control. Speaking of which, of course, Jeff is the one who starts the whole chicken finger operation, starting out in his classic group leader role, which is immediately, at least in a narrative sense at first, taken over by Abed, who begins his mafia movie-style narration that not only sets the tone for the rest of the episode, but jumps us right into a fun montage in which we see how the group manages to take over the chicken finger business. By the way, it's nice to see that the school newspaper makes a reappearance here, since we saw Jeff and in Abed working for the Gazette Journal Mirror in a previous episode, making it easier for them to publish an incriminating photo of Starburns. This leads into the previously mentioned hilarious interview and Abed being hired as a fry cook. What follows is quite interesting, as we see how Abed gains control of the operation, which sends Jeff into a bit of a panic because he's not used to having control being taken away from him, least of all from someone like Abed. As the power of the study group grows, so do their wishes, and said wishes range from understandable to quite ridiculous, such as Troy's pet monkey, who will actually become a bit of an important character later down the line. It's also really hilarious, but also surprisingly brutal to watch when the wishes and desires of the group grow too big, and Abed decides to send them a message, crossing the line over to property damage and bodily harm. Of course, the group decides to run back to Jeff, who has been ignored ever since Abed took over, and when Jeff goes to confront Abed, I think this is where we find the heart of the episode. Perhaps similar to what the viewer thought while watching, Jeff believed that Abed was only indulging in a mafia fantasy. But for Abed, this was indeed a very real and serious way to get closer to people. Since Abed views the world through the lens of TV shows and movies, he constantly applies the perception in order to understand the people around him. When people finally start living in the same world as him, he begins to understand and get closer to them. And generally speaking, people find Abed weird and unapproachable. So, of course, Abed would want to try and find a way to connect with them, and when he finally sees a possibility in which outsiders can join his perception of the world, he tries to keep up that reality as best he can. And all that because, as Abed admits to Jeff, he wants to make people happy. Abed, presumably, hasn't known friendship like this in a long time, if ever, even. Because of his difficulties in connecting with people, he often involuntarily distances himself from them. In Jeff, Abed sees the skills and personality traits which are required to connect with people more easily, so of course he tries to mimic those traits in whichever way he can, because all he wants to do is make the people around him happy. Similar to what occurs in Introduction to Film, We see here that while Arbit is confident in himself as a person, he still has social needs and desires, which he struggles to fulfill because his neurodivergence prevents him from approaching the world as easily as Jeff does. Perhaps it's a similar reason that causes Jeff to be upset in this episode, because he, though differently, also craves attention and companionship. In his case, it's because his own ego is not as confident as he likes to pretend it is. When control is being taken away from Jeff, he panics. He does no longer receive the attention he desires and is excluded from the study group, making him the odd one out, a position Jeff is not used to being in. When the two men finally come together at the end of the episode, having their talk in the cafeteria, we see once again that Arbit and Jeff understand each other in a way that arguably no other friendship pair in the group does. They share similar needs and desires, but for different reasons, and they each have personality traits and aspects the other one admires and aspires to have. We see that these two deeply care about each other and value one another. I think this can be seen in a nice little detail when Arbit suggests Jeff should see a professional and, as we see in later episodes, Jeff did indeed consider that advice and started seeing a therapist. And we also see once again that Jeff is one of the few people who actually get and respond to Arbit's pop culture references when Arbit suggests a Knight Rider or 16 Candles homage. This episode is the strongest season 1 example of what Community does best. Humorous homage and fun shenanigans, but all has heart and wholesome character interactions at the core. This episode not only manages to tell a ridiculous but entertaining story by adapting a mafia movie style, but it also intricately examines the characters which are at the center of the story, creating moments that make you laugh, but also moments that get you emotional. And this is why contemporary American poetry is my favorite episode of season 1. As far as first seasons go, Community really knocks it out of the park. Honestly, just like the rest of the show, season 1 is full of fun episodes which are all brilliant in their own way. Even the weaker ones only really have the problem of being a bit forgettable in the light of the better episodes, but even then, each single episode of the season is fun and entertaining as hell. We see the beginnings of what will become staples of the show, such as the genre homages, the Christmas and paintball episodes, and it's not like this first season came up with those ideas, but didn't perfect them yet. Some of those come out great straight away, such as Modern Warfare being the first, and for many the best paintball episode of the entire show. We see how well the show does homages and reference humor, stuff which is only going to be explored in even greater fashion in later episodes. Honestly, the only real difference this season has compared to later ones is perhaps the characterization of some study group members, such as Britta being more of the series' leading lady character, or Troy starting out as a jock, but already having his more nerdy characterization by the end of the season. The first season experiments with some characterizations and team-ups in the early episodes, but finds its footing pretty quickly, leading to some genuinely fantastic episodes and character moments in the second half of the season. The first season of Community sets up a strong foundation for many more great episodes to come, and I can't wait to dive into season 2 with all of you. Until then, thank you for making it this far. Please feel free to share your own episode ranking in the comments down below. I would love to hear your opinions. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done that already, and I'll see all of you very soon. Goodbye.